So here we consider the muscles that flex the neck, and we've got them listed here. The longus colli, which is extending from the cervical segments up to C2, so C2 to T3. The longus capitis, which is kind of like an extension of the scalene muscles, so it's attaching from C3 to C6 up to the foramen magnum, the anterior part. And then the rectus capitis anterior, which is a short muscle coming from C1 to the foramen magnum, just underneath the longus capitis muscle. And then the sternocleidomastoid, which is this big superficial muscle that goes from the clavicle to the mastoid process. And so this gives us this kind of crisscrossing look of these force vectors. And so we kind of look at this from and count the vertebrae here. So we have C1, which is the anterior arch is here, and then C2 kind of coming here with the spinous process, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7. And we can kind of see that F2 is the longus capitis running up from C all the way down from C6. And then we can see that the longus colli kind of spans the lower cervical segments up to C2. And then F4 does this interesting thing, or the sternocleidomastoid does this interesting thing where it starts anterior and then ends posterior. So it has actually a moment arm toward extension of upper cervical and a moment arm toward flexion of lower cervical. So we could ask two questions. What if you try to curl your spine up where you flex every single segment? Well, if you do that, it becomes obvious you can't use your sternocleidomastoid because it's going to extend the upper cervical spine because its moment arm runs posterior to the upper cervical segments and anterior to the lower cervical. So if you try to curl your spine up, you're really using the combination of the longus colli, the longus capitis, and the rectus capitis anterior to do that. And that's kind of answered in this equation where we look at the moments generated by each one of these muscles throughout the cervical spine would give us the peak internal moment to curl the spine up. And then if we asked a second question, what would the moment, if you tried to protract your head as hard as you could, what would be contributing to that? And that's mostly going to be the sternocleidomastoid. So we would have the moment generated by the sternocleidomastoid into extension on the upper cervical segments, so at each one of those vertebrae and their axis point, and then the flexion moment caused by the sternocleidomastoid at the lower cervical segments. So this would COC2, this would be an extension moment, an internal extension moment, and then at lower cervical segments, this would be an internal flexion moment.